They were stars even in death. From cryptic last wishes to downright bizarre burial plans, some of Hollywood's biggest legends made shocking requests that still raise eyebrows today. These aren't just stories about where they were laid to rest. These are glimpses into the private, often peculiar minds of Golden Age icons who wanted their final chapter to be just as unforgettable as their careers. One of them arranged to have a rose delivered to his wife every single day after he died. And that's just the beginning. Wallace Reid. In the silent film era, Wallace Reid was Hollywood royalty, a matinee idol whose face lit up theaters across America. But behind the charm and fame was a man quietly unraveling. After a studio-prescribed treatment led to a tragic addiction, Reid's health and career spiraled. Yet it was his final request that stunned even those closest to him, to be buried with a simple silver locket holding a photo of his wife, Dorothy Davenport. No grand tomb, no Hollywood flourish, just a modest grave and a hidden token of the love he felt he'd failed. In death, Reid stripped away the stardom and asked to be remembered not as a legend, but as a man searching for forgiveness. Bette Davis. Bette Davis wasn't just a star. She was a force of nature, fiercely independent and unapologetically bold. She battled studios, critics, and expectations to carve out a legacy on her own terms. So it's no surprise that even her epitaph would make a statement. Buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles, Davis chose the words, "She did it the hard way," for her tombstone, a final, defiant nod to a life lived without compromise. She rests alongside her mother, Ruthie, and her sister, Bobby, whose lives were deeply intertwined with her own. Despite their complicated relationships, Davis remained loyal to them both, supporting her sister through mental illness and crediting her mother for igniting her career. Her funeral drew Hollywood names but avoided lavish spectacle, just as she would have wanted. Today, her modest grave remains a powerful symbol, not just of a screen legend, but of a woman who never backed down. Jack Benny. Jack Benny mastered the art of timing, and his final gesture proved he still had one more act to deliver. Before his passing, the legendary comedian made an unusual request, that every day after his death, a single red rose be delivered to his wife, Mary Livingston. He arranged it in advance with a florist, turning a simple flower into a daily message of enduring love. For nearly a decade, Mary received those roses, each one a quiet whisper from Jack, "I'm still here." She kept them all, often clutching them and softly saying his name. His funeral drew comedy royalty, Bob Hope, George Burns, and others who had laughed beside him for decades. Yet Benny's burial held its own twist. Though not deeply religious, he chose Hillside Memorial Park, a Jewish cemetery in Los Angeles, leaving many to wonder if it was tradition, sentiment, or simply Jack being Jack, delivering a final surprise no one expected, a punchline without words, carried by a rose. John Wayne. When John Wayne died in 1979, many expected a grand Hollywood farewell for the man known as the Duke. But in true rugged fashion, Wayne's final act was anything but conventional. His family held a private ceremony, quietly laying him to rest in Newport Beach, overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a spot he loved in life. What shocked fans most, though, was what followed. For over 2 decades, Wayne's grave remained completely unmarked. No name, no inscription, just grass and sky. His family feared that a headstone would turn his resting place into a public shrine, disturbing the peace he'd sought in death. Admirers searched for years, hoping to find the exact location, often in vain. It wasn't until 1999 that a small bronze plaque was finally placed at the site, engraved with a line that captured his spirit. "Tomorrow is the most important thing in life." Even in death, John Wayne kept his legend alive, quietly, mysteriously, and on his own terms. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor lived life on her own terms, and she made sure her final farewell followed suit. Known for her violet eyes, lavish lifestyle, and larger-than-life presence, Taylor left one unforgettable instruction. She was to arrive at her own funeral fashionably late, not as a metaphor, but literally. Her casket was brought in 15 minutes after the service had already begun. It was a perfectly timed final entrance from a woman who never followed the rules. Taylor also requested to be buried with her favorite diamond studs, rumored to be worth a fortune, and chose an unmarked grave at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California. Some say it was to avoid becoming a tourist attraction. Others believe it was her last grasp at privacy after a lifetime in the spotlight. Either way, her final act was pure Elizabeth, bold, glamorous, and entirely unforgettable. John Barrymore. John Barrymore, one of Hollywood's most electrifying talents, left behind not just a legacy of brilliance, but one of its strangest legends. After his death in 1942, his body was embalmed and buried at Calvary Cemetery in Los Angeles. But rumor had it that his friends, including Errol Flynn and W.C. Fields, borrowed his body for a morbid prank, propping it up in a chair at Flynn's house. While Flynn later denied the story in his autobiography, the myth stuck, adding to Barrymore's reputation as a man whose life blurred the line between drama and reality. Decades later, his son, John Drew Barrymore, had his remains relocated to the family crypt at Mount Vernon Cemetery in Philadelphia, a tribute to the theatrical dynasty's deep roots in that city. Whether the infamous corpse prank was fact or fiction, it only amplified the aura surrounding Barrymore, an actor of unmatched charisma whose life and afterlife remained as grand, strange, and theatrical as the roles he played. W.C. Fields. W.C. Fields, the master of dry wit and well-timed sarcasm, left the world with one last joke, sort of. Though he spent decades working in Hollywood, Fields never hid his distaste for California. He famously quipped that his ideal epitaph would read, "On the whole, I'd rather be in Philadelphia," a nod to both his hometown and his enduring cynicism. Yet when he died in 1946, he was buried in California's Forest Lawn Memorial Park, far from the East Coast soil he claimed to prefer. His grave bears no humorous inscription, just a modest plaque, surprisingly understated for a man so bold in life. Though Fields had originally planned to be buried in Philadelphia, his family cited logistical reasons for the change. Whether accidental irony or poetic twist, Fields' final resting place reflects the contradictions that made him a legend: fiercely opinionated, endlessly quotable, and always, somehow, one step ahead of the punchline. Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi, the actor who forever defined Dracula, made one final request that blurred the line between man and monster. He asked to be buried in his full Dracula costume, cape and all. It wasn't a Hollywood stunt, but a deeply personal decision. Lugosi had spent his life both made and haunted by the role that brought him fame. Typecast and often misunderstood, he struggled to separate himself from the Count. But in the end, he chose to embrace him completely. When he died in 1956, nearly penniless and long past his career peak, his funeral was modest, attended by only close friends and family. Yet his burial site at Holy Cross Cemetery in California became a macabre shrine for horror fans, drawn to the legend of the man who became his role. Lugosi's final wish wasn't just theatrical, it was tragic. It reflected a life where the line between character and self had blurred so deeply not even death could separate them. Pola Negri. Pola Negri, the silent film star known for her sweeping romances and grand gestures, lived her life like a drama, and her death was no different. The Polish-born actress, once romantically linked to Rudolph Valentino, left behind a final request that stunned even her closest friends. She wished to be buried with a vial of Valentino's ashes. The claim raised eyebrows, as Valentino was never officially cremated, and no records support the existence of such ashes. Yet Negri swore she possessed a small vial, a token from their whirlwind affair. Was it truth, fantasy, or simply one last dramatic flourish? No one knows for sure. Her grave in California reflects her old-world elegance, adorned with ornate carvings and European flair. Over time, it became less a burial site and more a shrine to her legend. Whether the ashes were real or symbolic, Negri's final act was pure theater, leaving behind a mystery as timeless as the silver screen she once ruled. Rudolph Valentino. Rudolph Valentino, Hollywood's original Latin lover, died suddenly in 1926 at just 31, his death sending shockwaves through the film world. Though he left no documented burial request, his friends made sure his final resting place reflected his legendary status. He was laid to rest in a borrowed crypt at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, intended as a temporary solution. Nearly a century later, he remains there, his grave transformed into a shrine. But what truly fueled the legend was the mysterious Lady in Black, who began appearing each year on the anniversary of his death, leaving a single red rose. Over time, others adopted the tradition, keeping the mystery alive. Valentino's grave became more than a memorial. It became a symbol of eternal allure, undying devotion, and Hollywood myth-making. In death, as in life, Valentino remained a figure of passion, drama, and intrigue, his burial not just an ending but the start of an enduring legend. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford, Hollywood's queen of melodrama, left behind a final request as stark and unsettling as some of her most iconic roles. Upon her death in 1977, she asked to be cremated and placed in a modest crypt at Ferncliff Cemetery in New York, far from the spotlight she once ruled. But the true drama came in her will. She deliberately excluded her two eldest children, Christina and Christopher, with the cold line, for reasons which are well known to them. The decision fueled public speculation, especially after Christina's explosive memoir Mommy Dearest cast Crawford as a cruel and controlling mother. Her ashes were placed beside her final husband, Alfred Steele, yet the grave itself remained surprisingly understated, almost anonymous. For a woman who spent her life commanding the screen, Joan Crawford's quiet burial and chilling final words left behind a legacy not just of stardom, but of haunting unanswered questions. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead, known for her smoky voice, razor wit, and rule-breaking spirit, left the world with a final request as unforgettable as her life. She asked to be buried with a bottle of bourbon, a pack of cigarettes, and a copy of the Bible. It was classic Tallulah, irreverent, wild, yet quietly reflective. Her funeral in the early 1960s was subdued, but her burial instructions injected a flash of her signature defiance. Rather than a Hollywood cemetery, she chose to be laid to rest in St. Paul's Churchyard in Maryland, close to her family's roots. It was an unexpected choice for a woman who had spent her life challenging every expectation. That final mix of rebellion, humor, and sentimentality perfectly captured her essence. Even in death, Tallulah refused to be ordinary, leaving behind not just a grave, but a legend. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich, the glamorous star of The Blue Angel in Morocco, captivated the world with her elegance and defiance. But in death, she made a quiet, surprising return to her roots. When she passed on May 6, 1992, at age 90, Dietrich chose to be buried in Berlin, the very city she had once renounced. During World War II, she had openly opposed the Nazi regime and spent much of her life in self-imposed exile, becoming an American citizen and a symbol of anti-fascist resistance. Her decision to be laid to rest in Berlin's Friedenau Cemetery beside her mother shocked many and sparked speculation. Was it a final act of reconciliation with her homeland? Dietrich never explained. Her funeral was small and private, attended only by close friends and family. The German government offered a state funeral, but her family declined. Still, the public response was overwhelming. Fans gathered at her modest grave, marked only by her name, birth, and death year. Subtle, yet powerful, her resting place continues to draw admirers from around the world, reflecting the lasting mystique of a woman who refused to be defined by anyone but herself. Clark Gable. Clark Gable, the legendary king of Hollywood and star of Gone with the Wind, left behind a burial request that revealed a far more vulnerable side than the rugged persona he portrayed on screen. When he passed away in 1960, Gable asked to be buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, but not just anywhere. He chose to be laid to rest beside Carole Lombard, his third wife and the love of his life, who had died tragically in a plane crash nearly 2 decades earlier. Though Gable remarried after her death, he never stopped mourning her. His wish to be by her side in death was a quiet but powerful tribute to a love that never faded. His grave, marked by a simple plaque, stands in stark contrast to his Hollywood fame, humble, understated, and deeply personal. It speaks not of celebrity, but of a man shaped by loss, loyalty, and a romance that endured far beyond the spotlight. Theda Bara. Theda Bara, the silent screen's original vamp and one of Hollywood's earliest icons of mystery, remained just as enigmatic in death as she was in life. Known for her dark, seductive roles and carefully constructed image of exotic allure, Bara's real self was far more reserved, and her burial wishes proved it. When she passed away in 1955, she requested to be cremated and have her ashes scattered into the Pacific Ocean. At a time when cremation was still uncommon, especially for celebrities, her wish reflected a quiet rejection of Hollywood's theatrics. Yet her final journey didn't happen immediately. Her ashes were kept by family members for years, as they struggled to carry out her instructions due to emotional and logistical hurdles. Only decades later were her remains finally released into the sea, fulfilling the actress's poetic desire to dissolve back into nature. The mystique around Bera only grew after her death, as most of her films were tragically lost in a 1937 fire at Fox Studios. With little surviving footage, her legend lives on not through reels of celluloid, but through a legacy of vanished glamour, lingering questions, and a final wish as haunting as the character she once played. Mary Pickford. Mary Pickford, known as America's Sweetheart and one of early Hollywood's most influential figures, made a final request that spoke more to her heart than her fame. When she passed away in 1979, she chose to be buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, but not just anywhere. Her resting place lies in the Garden of Memory, a quiet, secluded corner of the cemetery, beside her mother and siblings. For a woman who once commanded the spotlight, this decision was deeply personal, rooted in a lifelong devotion to family. Her crypt bears the title that made her famous America's Sweetheart, a label she both embraced and resented. Though she helped build the foundation of the film industry, Pickford often struggled with the pressures of her public image. Her modest burial site is a reminder that beyond the lights and legacy was a woman simply seeking peace, surrounded by the people who mattered most. Mae West. Mae West, the queen of double entendres and unapologetic sass, left behind a burial plan as bold as the life she lived. When she passed away in 1980, she was buried in Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn, the city of her birth, a nod to her lifelong connection to her roots, despite her towering Hollywood fame. Her final resting place lies within the family mausoleum, but it's the inscription that truly captures her essence. Mae West, I'm no angel, a witty reference to one of her most iconic films. True to form, West made sure even her burial had flair. She was dressed in a glamorous gown of her choosing, one she'd picked out years earlier, proving she intended to steal the spotlight even in death. Her funeral wasn't just a farewell, it was a final performance. For a woman who famously said, "You only live once, but if you do it right, once is enough," Mae West's resting place is a perfect tribute to a life lived entirely on her own terms. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo, the elusive star who once declared, "I want to be alone," carried that sentiment into death. When she passed away in 1990, her burial reflected the privacy she fiercely protected throughout her life. Garbo requested cremation and chose to be laid to rest in her native Sweden, far from the spotlight of Hollywood. Her ashes were interred at Skog's Kyrkogården Cemetery in Stockholm, a tranquil UNESCO World Heritage Site known for its peaceful beauty. Remarkably, Garbo had purchased the burial plot decades earlier, in the 1950s, a quiet, symbolic act of returning to her roots after years of seclusion in New York City. Her grave is marked with a simple headstone bearing only her name, perfectly in tune with the mystery she cultivated both on and off screen. For a woman who avoided the public eye for most of her life, even her final resting place honors that same desire for solitude. An elegant farewell from one of Hollywood's most enigmatic legends. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn, the dashing star of The Adventures of Robin Hood, made a final request as extravagant as his legendary lifestyle. When he died in 1959, he wished to be buried with a 6-foot statue of a woman, an ornate centerpiece from his home that symbolized his indulgent, hedonistic spirit. But the request was never fulfilled. The statue was deemed too impractical for burial. Instead, Flynn was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, beneath a surprisingly simple marker, a stark contrast to the larger-than-life persona he projected both on and off screen. Even his funeral defied expectations. Only a small group of close friends and family attended. A quiet farewell for a man whose name once stirred headlines around the world. Though the statue stayed above ground, Flynn's wish offered one last glimpse into the flamboyant, unapologetic character of a star who lived without restraint and left behind a legacy soaked in charisma, controversy, and myth. Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow, Hollywood's original blonde bombshell, left behind a legacy of dazzling beauty and quiet tragedy, and a burial that mirrored both. When she died suddenly in 1937 at just 26, the world was stunned. Her final wish was heartbreakingly simple: to be buried in a white gown, surrounded by white flowers, within a white marble crypt. It wasn't just a nod to her platinum-haired screen image. It was a symbolic desire to be remembered as pure, untouched by the scandals and sorrows that shadowed her short life. Harlow was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California in the Great Mausoleum, a resting place so grand it's often called the Taj Mahal of the West. What many don't know is that the crypt was paid for by her grief-stricken lover, actor William Powell, who spared no expense to give her a farewell fit for a queen. Even in death, Jean Harlow's story remained one of beauty, mystery, and a stardom that continues to shimmer through the decades. If you enjoyed this glimpse into Hollywood's golden age, don't forget to like, subscribe, and step into the next story. There's always more behind the curtain.